Welcome to Smart Finance Talks.
Today, we're looking at something pretty fundamental, this idea of moving towards a cashless society.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And our main guide for this is Kenneth Rogoff's book, The Curse of Cash.
Exactly. Rogoff lays out this, controversial case for seriously cutting back on physical money, maybe even eliminating it.
So we're going to unpack that.
We are.
Yeah.
We'll look at his core arguments, dip into the history of currency, which is fascinating in itself, and, think about what the future might hold.
Right. The goal is to pull out the key ideas from the book, explore the economic, social, political sides of it.
And hopefully find some surprising things along the way.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Why even talk about phasing out cash? I mean, it feels so, normal, basic.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But Rogoff ties it directly to a big challenge for central banks specifically, how hard it is to use negative interest rates when they need to.
Negative interest rates. Explain that a bit.
So the idea is physical cash always gives you a 0% return, right? It can't go negative.
Okay, yeah. It just sits there.
Exactly. And that acts as a floor. It stops central banks from pushing interest rates deep into negative territory if the economy really tanks.
Because people would just pull their money out as cash.
Precisely. If your bank account starts charging you interest, you just take out bundles of notes and stick them under the mattress, metaphorically speaking.
Got it. So cash limits monetary policy.
In a way, yes. It kind of handcuffs them during downturns, potentially making recessions longer or deeper.
And this isn't a brand new thought, is it?
Oh, no. Rogoff points back to Henry in 1976, I think, and his own earlier work. He's been talking about getting rid of large denomination bills for a long time.
Those big notes, like the old Canadian $1,000 bill or the 500 note, always seemed a bit shady.
Well, that's part of the argument.
Yeah.
And Rogoff makes a comparison to anonymous bearer bonds.
Ah, the things you see in spy movies.
Kind of. They used to be more common, a way to move wealth anonymously. But they're largely banned now, certainly in the U.S., phased out elsewhere. Concerns about tax evasion, terrorism financing.
And he sees cash heading the same way.
He suggests it might be on a similar path, especially the large bills.
Interesting. Now, thinking about getting rid of cash, that must have ruffled some feathers over the years.
Oh, definitely. Strong pushback. Rogoff mentions Marvin Goodfriend back in 2000. He proposed basically marking cash to tax it.
Marking it? Wow, how did that go down?
Not well. Lots of criticism. And then Greg Benke had this sort of thought experiment, a lottery based on serial numbers where losing notes become worthless.
A banknote lottery? That sounds chaotic.
It was more illustrative, I think, but it shows how attached people are to cash, how resistant they are to messing with it.
So, given that resistance, what's the actual plan Rogoff lays out? It can't be overnight.
No, definitely not. He suggests something very gradual, maybe over 10, 15 years.
Okay.
Start by phasing out the big bills, the $100, the 500s, then maybe move to smaller bills later, possibly even coins eventually, though he suggests keeping small denominations around.
Why keep the small stuff?
Well, the main goal is to hinder those large anonymous transactions, the kind often used in the underground economy or for crime.
Right.
But you still want people to be able to buy coffee,
Yeah.
do everyday things. So keeping smaller bills and coins addresses some concerns about financial inclusion and day-to-day convenience.
And this long timeline gives everyone a chance to adapt.
That's the idea. Let businesses adjust, let people get used to digital options, and let policymakers sort out any unexpected kinks that pop up.
You mentioned some countries are already moving this way, Scandinavia, Sweden.
Yeah, Sweden is a really interesting case. They've moved quite far towards being a less cash society.
Why them specifically?
It seems to be a mix of things. Safety concerns, like banks not wanting to handle cash after robberies, plus the huge popularity of instant mobile payment apps, Swish, I think it's called.
Right.
Their experience, while still evolving, suggests maybe some of the fears about going cashless are manageable. Denmark is another example. They have an app called Mobile Pay that's everywhere. And the government has pushed for basic digital accounts.
It really makes you think about the history. Cash wasn't always king.
Absolutely not. And history, especially China's history, is really instructive here.
How so?
They were way ahead of the game with paper money. We're talking the 11th, 15th centuries Song and Yuan dynasties.
That early? Wow.
Yeah. The Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan came closest to a modern paper system. But, and this is key, they didn't have an independent central bank controlling inflation.
So what happened?
Well, the book has this figure 2.1, showing paper money issuance alongside rice prices.
Yeah.
You print more money, the price of rice goes up. A pretty direct illustration of inflation caused by well, just printing too much money without restraint.
A lesson learned the hard way centuries ago. What about the West?
In the American colonies, paper money popped up quite early too. Massachusetts, 1690.
Why so early there?
Basically, a shortage of British coins and metal. They were even using things like seashells and tobacco as currency for a while. Yeah. And the Spanish silver dollar, the piece of 8, was a big international currency. But the colonies, embracing what we now call fiat money, valuable by government decree, not backed by gold that early, pretty significant. Our dollars, euros, they're all fiat currencies now.
Puts things in perspective. And the whole international system has shifted too, right? Gold standard, Bretton Woods.
Exactly. From gold to the Bretton Woods system after World War II, which linked currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold.
Until Nixon.
Until Nixon pulled the plug in the early 70s. That basically brought us back to a global fiat system, kind of like Yuan Dynasty China, but hopefully with better management. And that's the world we're in now, debating the future of cash within that system.
Okay, so cash has this long, complicated history. Let's get a handle on today. Just how much physical cash are we talking about globally? It must be huge.
It really is. Rogoff cites over $1 trillion in circulation. And the equivalent in Chinese yuan is even bigger. That's a lot of physical money floating around relative to the size of these economies.
$1 trillion. And who actually has all this cash? Do we know?
That's the $1 million question, or maybe the $1 trillion question. Central banks know how much they've issued, but tracking who holds it, individuals, businesses, criminals, whether it's inside the country or outside, is incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's not like cash comes with a GPS tracker.
Exactly. This lack of data is a real challenge for understanding cash's role.
Can we learn anything by comparing different countries?
We can see some interesting patterns, like within the Eurozone countries, using the euro.
Yeah.
People in Germany and Austria tend to hold significantly more cash relative to their GDP, compared to France, for instance, even though it's the same currency used since 2002.
Huh. Any idea why? Cultural preferences?
Could be cultural preferences, maybe historical reasons, anonymity concerns. It's complex. The book has some charts showing these differences, and Table 3.1 highlights something else. In many places, like Japan or Switzerland, a huge proportion, over 90% of the value of cash in circulation, is in large denomination bills.
So most of the money isn't in the small bills people actually use day to day.
Exactly. It's tied up in these big notes, the ones you rarely see at the checkout counter, which suggests they're being used more for storing value or perhaps for less legitimate purposes.
And what about cash held outside its home country, like US dollars abroad?
That's another big chunk. The Federal Reserve tries to estimate it using export data and customs declarations.
But that seems leaky. Smuggling.
Obviously. Rogoff points out the limitations. You can't really track cash smuggled across borders. There's also significant demand for euros outside the Eurozone, maybe in nearby EU countries that don't use the euro, or even further afield.
So there's this whole global shadow demand for certain currencies.
It seems that way. And interestingly, the amount of cash actually held by banks, in vaults and ATMs, it's surprisingly small compared to the total supply.
Really?
Yeah, in the US, maybe only around 5% of the total physical currency.
Wow. So most of it is just out there, in wallets, under floorboards.
Or circulating in the domestic or global underground economy. And Rogoff breaks down this demand. He talks about a sort of dual nature.
How so?
Large bills, he argues, are predominantly used for hoarding wealth and for illicit activities, tax evasion, crime.
Okay.
Smaller bills are more for everyday transactions, especially crucial for lower-income households and the unbanked population.
The unbanked, that's a key point, isn't it?
Absolutely. In the U.S., something like 8% of adults don't have bank accounts, and maybe another 20% are underbanked. They have an account but still rely heavily on cash or alternative financial services. Moving away from cash raises serious equity concerns for these groups.
You'd have to ensure they weren't left behind. Now let's focus on that link Rogoff makes between cash and the underground economy. Tax evasion first.
Right. He argues cash is a major facilitator of tax evasion, especially for small businesses, maybe contractors, anyone who can easily underreport cash income.
How big a problem is this?
The estimates for the tax gap, the difference between taxes owed and taxes collected, are huge. Hundreds of billions annually just in the U.S. And a big slice of that is attributed to underreported income in sectors where cash transactions are common. Digital payments leave a trail, cash doesn't.
So anonymity is the key issue there. And it goes beyond just taxes, right? More serious crime.
Definitely. Rogoff connects cash directly to corruption. He gives examples China, Nigeria, Indonesia, even places like Canada and Finland aren't immune.
The story of the Chinese general with cash stacked in his house.
Yeah, millions found in cash. It's just hard to do that without physical currency. And then there are darker links to human trafficking, forced labor. The ILO estimates millions are victims globally, and these horrific crimes often rely on untraceable cash payments.
It's a grim picture of the downsides of cash, but governments do benefit from issuing cash, don't they? This thing called seigniorage.
They do. Seigniorage is the profit made from printing money, basically. The difference between the face value of a note and the tiny cost to produce it.
Is it significant?
It can be, yeah. It's a source of revenue, and central banks often bring it up when eliminating cash is discussed. It helps fund their independence, arguably.
So getting rid of cash means losing that income stream, but Rogoff also flips it, talking about the costs of cash, especially regarding negative rates.
Right. If you wanted a fully cashless system and negative rates, the government would have to buy back all that zero-interest cash. How? Probably by issuing interest-bearing debt.
Which costs money.
It does. Maybe not much if rates are near zero anyway.
Yeah.
But it's a long-term consideration. He also notes the irony. While cash enables crime, anti-money laundering rules already make it hard for criminals to deposit large sums of cash without attracting attention.
A bit of a catch-22. Okay, so Rogoff proposes his own plan. We touched on it being gradual. What are the key elements?
Gradual, yes, 10, 15 years. Phase out large bills first. But crucially, he stresses the need for government support to ensure access for the poor and unbanked.
How?
Subsidies, maybe providing basic, free, or very low-cost digital bank accounts, offering a certain number of free digital transactions per month.
What would that cost?
He throws out an estimate for the U.S., maybe around $32 billion a year. A significant sum.
But potentially offset by gains from reduced crime and tax evasion.
That's the argument. And what about stability? Could a purely digital system be unstable?
Good question.
Rogoff acknowledges that concern.
Yeah.
He mentions theoretical work, like Wallace's ideas about digital money possibly becoming unstable if it's too easily substitutable with other assets. And modern economic models sometimes have this issue of multiple equilibria, basically. A big shift away from cash could unsettle things unexpectedly because it disrupts long-held habits.
So how do we avoid that?
His answer is the slow, government-managed transition. That allows time to address issues. And again, look at Sweden and Denmark. They're managing a shift towards less cash, driven partly by technology like mobile payments.
And getting rid of big notes helped there.
Seems so. In Sweden, the use of the 1,000 krona note plummeted after they stopped issuing it. Rogoff's point is that keeping these large bills mainly for illicit use is, as he puts it, penny-wise, pound-foolish.
Right, the costs outweigh the benefits. Okay, let's dig into negative interest rates more. Why is this near zero lower bound such a problem?
Well, when interest rates hit zero, or just above it, central banks run out of their main tool for stimulating a weak economy. They can't cut rates much further.
Unlike in the past.
Exactly. Think back to the 70s and 80s. The big worry was high inflation. Central banks had plenty of room to raise rates. Now, often, the problem is weak growth and inflation that's too low. Being stuck at zero limits their ability to respond.
And negative rates could help.
Potentially, yes, it would give them more ammunition. Fed economists estimated that if they could have gone significantly negative back in the 2008 crisis, it might have shortened the recession or lessened its severity.
Is being stuck at zero a new problem?
Not entirely. The UK faced it during the Great Depression. Japan hit it in the 1990s and has struggled with it for decades. The book has a chart showing this history.
So what do banks do when they're stuck?
One tool they've used is forward guidance, basically promising to keep rates low for a long time to try and influence borrowing and spending today.
So negative rates offer another way out of that trap. But, as we said, cash is a major hurdle. Are there other ways around the zero bound that don't require eliminating cash?
Yeah, economists have kicked around a few ideas.
Like what?
One is pretty straightforward.
Right.
Just target a higher rate of inflation. If the targets are only 2%, aim for 4%.
Yeah.
That gives you more room above zero for nominal rates before real rates adjusted for inflation, get too high.
Okay, simple enough. What else?
There's nominal GDP targeting. Instead of just inflation, target the growth rate of the entire economy in dollar terms.
Interesting.
Another idea you hear about is helicopter money.
Literally dropping money from helicopters.
Metaphorically.
Oh.
Just sending checks directly to people. Though there's a debate linked to something called Ricardian equivalence about whether people would just save it expecting higher taxes later, especially if the central bank just creates the money.
Okay, those are some alternatives. Rogoff mentions some more, let's say, exotic ideas too.
He does. There's this two-currency model, Kapolai, Eisler, Buder, and Kimball. It's complex, but the gist is charging a fee to convert large amounts of bank-held physical cash into electronic central bank reserves. Basically, making electronic money slightly more convenient than stacks of cash for banks.
Trying to break the perfect equivalence between cash and digital money.
Kind of. Then there are older ideas, like stamped money, Silvio Giselle's concept, where banknotes expired unless you bought and attached stamps. Seen as too impractical.
Yeah, sounds cumbersome.
Buder and Eisler also had a dual currency idea. More recently, Agarwal and Kimball proposed a way to effectively get negative rates on cash by charging banks a fee when they deposit physical cash back at the central bank.
So the negative rate gets passed through the banking system onto cash holdings.
That's the theory. Rogoff, though, tends to argue that these partial solutions are less effective than just phasing out most cash if you really want to overcome the zero-bound constraint. He also notes there are historical precedents for dual currency systems, like the U.S. using greenbacks alongside gold-backed currency during the Civil War.
Lots of creative thinking there.
Yeah.
But even if you solve the cash problem, are there other limits to how negative rates can actually go?
Probably. Rogoff uses this analogy of wading into water. The deeper you go, the more negative rates become, the harder and riskier it gets.
What kind of risks?
Well, there's the whole debate. Should central banks only focus on inflation and growth? Or should they also worry about financial stability bubbles, risky lending when setting rates?
Right. Low rates might encourage excessive risk-taking.
Exactly. Many argue you should use other tools, macroprudential regulation, like adjusting bank capital requirements or loan-to-value ratios to handle those risks, rather than using the blunt instrument of interest rates.
Keep the tools separate.
That's one view. And we should also remember, while hyperinflation is rare in developed countries, significant inflation is an ancient history. The U.S. hit double digits around 1980. Japan saw big spikes in the 70s. Low inflation forever isn't guaranteed.
Good point. Now, negative rates. It feels a bit like a tax, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A tax on holding money. Rogoff calls it a potential tax on trust.
Yeah, it's a provocative phrase. He links it to history. Governments have a long track record of debasing currency when they're desperate. Think Henry VIII melting down coins and adding cheaper metals.
So the fear is governments might be tempted to use negative rates irresponsibly.
Or try to inflate away their debts. That's always a temptation. Though Rogoff argues it's actually hard to do deliberately in modern developed economies because prices and wages adjust slowly.
Okay.
But maintaining central bank independence, keeping politicians hands off monetary policy, could become trickier in a world with negative rates. The political pressure might increase.
Then the whole relationship between money supply and inflation has gotten fuzzier too, hasn't it?
It has. Since the 70s, financial innovation has complicated things. Remember the case of the missing money economists talked about? It's harder now to predict inflation just by looking at how much money is out there. Central bank credibility becomes crucial, balancing predictability with the flexibility to act.
A delicate balancing act indeed. Now, if one major country, like the US, phased out cash, what happens internationally?
Big question. As we said, there's huge international demand for dollars and euros, partly for the underground economy.
So if the US ditches large bills,
It could lose seniority revenue.
Yeah.
And maybe the Eurozone benefits if the euro becomes the preferred underground currency. It's speculative, but possible.
and coordinating negative rates globally.
Very difficult. Imagine the US cutting rates deeply negative while Europe doesn't. Capital flows could get chaotic. Historically, the Fed doesn't really base its decisions on what's best for other countries. Its mandate is domestic.
So going cashless could have some messy international consequences. What about alternatives? Digital currencies, Bitcoin, gold.
Rogoff is pretty skeptical about cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin replacing traditional money. He sees the future more likely in government-issued digital currencies.
Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
Exactly. He acknowledges the potential of the underlying blockchain or distributed ledger technology, but thinks governments will want to maintain control. He also stresses governments need access to liquid funds in crises, which private crypto doesn't guarantee.
So he sees crypto as more of a niche.
Sort of. He recognizes the fundamental belief of crypto fans in a system free from banks and government control, but he doesn't think digital currencies are the main driver pushing us towards less paper money right now. That's more about the crime and interest rate arguments.
Got it. Now, the book has a postscript reflecting on events after it was written. What did he add?
He looked at India's sudden demonetization in 2016, withdrawing large banknotes virtually overnight.
That caused chaos, didn't it?
Huge disruption. A real-world example of why a sudden move is a bad idea, reinforcing his call for gradualism. He also touches on Donald Trump's election, the focus on illegal immigration, and how cash facilitates off-the-books employment for undocumented workers.
Linking immigration policy to cash demand.
Yeah. He notes historical precedents for sudden cash withdrawals: West Germany after WWII, France in the late 50s, but argues strongly against doing that in the U.S., especially given how much U.S. currency is held abroad. A sudden move could be destabilizing. He even connects Trump's border wall proposal to the demand for anonymous cash payments for labor.
Wow. And the appendix gets technical.
Yeah, it dives into things like the fiscal theory of the price level and different versions of the Taylor rule for setting interest rates more for the economics nerds among us.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the curse of cash?
I'd say the core is Rogoff's argument that cash, especially large bills, facilitates crime and tax evasion, and significantly hinders central banks' ability to fight recessions by preventing deeply negative interest rates.
And the history shows money is always evolving.
Definitely. From China's early paper money to today's fiat system, it's never been static. The zero lower bound problem is real and has spurred a lot of creative, sometimes controversial policy thinking. And while digital currencies are coming, Rogoff sees government-backed ones as the likely path forward.
What were some of the most surprising or intriguing bits for you?
Just the sheer scale of cash held outside the U.S., that was eye-opening. Also, how early the American colonies adopted paper money. And that Chinese chart linking money printing to rice prices centuries ago, such a clear, simple illustration.
Yeah, and the fact that most cash value is in big bills, not everyday notes.
Right, it challenges how you typically think about cash.
So, why should listeners care about all this? It feels a bit abstract, maybe.
Well, it really isn't abstract when you think about it. This touches on how our economy is managed, financial stability, crime prevention, privacy, fairness, and the future of technology in our daily lives. Understanding these arguments helps you make sense of the potential policy shifts that could affect everyone.
So finally, a provocative thought to leave everyone mulling over.
Okay, how about this? As we move towards an ever more digital world, what is the ideal role, if any, for physical cash? We talk about the trade-offs, convenience versus privacy, efficiency versus inclusion. But what does the optimal balance look like? And are we absolutely sure we understand all the potential unintended consequences of marginalizing or eliminating something that's been part of human society for centuries? What might we lose that we haven't even considered yet?
That's definitely something to think about. The known unknowns and maybe the unknown unknowns. Great stuff. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until next time.